welcome out. We're kind of jury rigging this a little bit. When we actually put it into presentation mode earlier, it vanished. So we got it this far, and we can work it. So we're going to run it from this this way. So whatever works. So I see these. So this is like the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting for the Brewers Summit, I take it. Everybody's out looking for their next, come with the cups and stand in front of the still out there. So yes, we are talking about moonshine and white lightning, Mountain Dew, hooch, whatever you want to call it. And my name's Jim Rada. I've done some writing about it for articles here in this area, also out in Western Maryland. I was just telling him about an interesting story out there where they ran out of water. Too many moonshiners were using water out in the Frostburg area. They were having to put pleas in the paper for them to not use city water. So, very popular side gig for people. So this all began, or all the problems, let's say, began with the amendment, the 18th Amendment. And as you can see, went into effect 1919. That is when it became essentially illegal to, you could drink alcohol, but it was illegal to produce it, sell it, or transport it. So essentially you had to have it already once that amendment went into effect. And once it did, well, they say nature abhors a vacuum, and that's what happened. When there is a demand for something that is not being filled, people will find a way to fill it. And that brought us about illegal moonshining, because it had been going on for many years, but a smaller scale, some of it legal, but a lot of it illegal. But it dates back to the Whiskey Rebellion, when Western Pennsylvania farmers decided, every year they would use their excess corn, rather than have it go bad and lose it, they would turn it into liquor, because you could store liquor, and then they could sell it at their leisure. And then the government came along, taxing it, wanted that tax revenue off of it, and these farmers said no, and led to the Whiskey Rebellion. In fact, there is a home north of Gettysburg, has a plaque, one of those historic Pennsylvania markers out front saying Washington slept there. Well, he slept there on his way out to quell the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, during Prohibition, Catoctin Mountain in particular it was discovered they had a very good reputation for the whiskey they produced. There was an interview that was done by the Youth Conservation Corps in 1972, and they talked to Howard Damuth. Is that how you pronounce that? Damuth. I always get that one wrong. So they had interviewed him, and he had talked about how during Prohibition, he was a salesman in New York City, and he'd go up there and he discovered that Catoctin whiskey up there had a very good reputation as being some of the best on the East Coast. So they had a good recipe here. Now, one of the things, once Prohibition kicked into high gear, a pint of whiskey, at least in the Hagerstown area, was selling for about $16, about 10 times normal price. So you can see, very profitable, very attractive, turned a lot of law-abiding citizens into criminals as far as the federal government was concerned. Harbaugh Valley, they apparently like to make they had stills making nice fruit brandy with all their excess fruit down there. Now, you got the still out here. This is a drawing of a still that was made by an old miner from Western Maryland. I have his, he'd written some memoirs, unpublished memoirs, and I have a copy of it. And in it, he drew his still setup that he used to run back in the Western Maryland mountains. So you can see how it all fits together with his little diagram. His name was Kenny Bray. And so you needed the average size still, about 14.5 gallons. How big's that one out there?
That's probably about a 50-gallon.
Okay, so that's about the size of the one out of Catoctin Mountain Park. But I guess the small moonshiners, small operation, maybe a single person moonshiner, would run about a 14.5 gallon still. Copper, you wanted a copper boiler. That curved copper tubing, which you got out there, you also wanted that to be copper. It ran from the top of the boiler to the cooling tub. And then the boiler lid got sealed by flour paste. And then you had more copper tubing called a worm come out of the cooling tub, and that's where the moonshine would drip out of. Essentially, what you were doing was you're making a mash, evaporating the alcohol in the boiler, and that's what was, pushed over into the cooling tub. The cooling tub then allowed that alcohol to condense again as a purer form. Now, for those of you who want your own recipe, Kenny also had his recipe.
Did you ever have it tested to see what proof it came out as?
If he did not say. But the thing was, the more times you ran it through with those X's, each, 3X was about as many times as somebody would run it through, but that would, increase the potency and how well it tasted, how good it tasted. So the recipe that he used started with a bushel of corn or grain, 50 pounds of sugar, a couple cakes of yeast, and 35 to 50 gallons of water. So remember that starting number of water and all those ingredients. So it gets all mixed into a barrel, left to ferment into a mash. So you mix it in, ferment it, let it ferment in that barrel. Then you start, once it ferments, the grain settles, you scrape off the what floats to the top, and that's what gets distilled. Well, that's what actually goes into the boiler. The boiler gets filled with the mash almost up to the top, heated to a low fire, or heated on a low fire. And because alcohol will evaporate quicker than water, or at a lower boiling point than water, you want it to keep that fire low, just enough to get the alcohol to evaporate and get into that tubing. And so then, and like I said, it moves over where it's condensed back into a purer form of alcohol, without a lot of the other ingredients that were in the mash with it. So the first run, that first set that comes out of the cooling tub is called a singling. And then you really wouldn't want to eat or drink that. It was, very rough, very nasty tasting, but sometimes in shortcuts they would try and dress it up. But if it's a good moonshine, like apparently they made here, they'd run it through again. Take what from that bucket, put it into a boiler that was cleaned and scrubbed, and run it through. And then what comes out again, put back into a clean boiler, heat it up, run through again. So you got, each time it goes through, it's singling, doubling, tripling. And that third one, that 3, represents the 3 X's on a moonshine jug. And that was the final product that most people were shooting for, if you were making a good quality product. So there's a still in operation for you. Now, they would also, maybe you could get it through on a doubling and get a good quality, but each time they would test it. So they would throw a teaspoon of the alcohol onto flames. If it went, they knew it needed some more distilling. If it just sizzled, they knew they got it right. So they knew they'd gone through enough. Now, as a little trick, all that 50 gallons of water and all those other ingredients, once you went through 3 times, Kenny said you had about 10 gallons of moonshine. So you're really distilling it down. I mean, that's the whole nature of the word. But he also said a little trick his grandfather used, which was to use honey instead of sugar. And it made a nice honey brandy, he called it. So, there's one of the moonshine jugs there. So I mentioned some of the shortcuts they can take to, try and dress it up. Anything they could do to make, high profit item, but they still wanted more profit. So you needed to either make it faster, make it cheaper. So they would try and get more from your runs. So they would double the first run in mash instead of water. They'd use a 55-gallon steel drum instead of a copper boiler. And the thing is, copper, you weren't going to get a lot of harmful metals from a copper boiler. It did not flake off like a steel drum would. So you were really essentially poisoning people with toxic metals if you didn't use a good high-quality copper boiler. Some moonshiners would just push the run to the limit, so that last few ounces or whatever you're pushing out of a mash run, just very weak, very, not a good quality compared to the beginning of the run, but they, push it to its limit and then mix it into the good stuff. Then you get the moonshiners that would put rubbing alcohol in the mash to increase the amount of run they could get from the run. So they'd mix in rubbing alcohol. Again, take that stuff straight, you're dead. But they dilute it, mix it in, it would still have that alcohol kick, and you could still buy rubbing alcohol. So they could turn a pint of 70% rubbing alcohol into 2 pints of 70 proof whiskey. They'd put other stuff in to ferment other than grains. Overripe fruit was a popular item. And then, you want it to look that nice color. A lot of times, a minor way to do that was, I was told by a Catoctin moonshiner, or one of his kids, that they would put the moonshine on like a radiator, let it heat up on a radiator, and it would color, look like it was aged. Some people didn't even want to wait that long, so they'd use things like iodine or tobacco juice. Give it that little special kick. But you all wanted samples. This is what you would get.
I missed the sampling, I guess.
Some of moonshiners found 14-ounce bottles that looked pretty close to 16-ounce. And so kind of what they're doing nowadays in the grocery stores.
Yes.
You're getting a lot less in the same sort of looking packaging. Now, one story I thought was hilarious. These moonshiners, I don't even know if you can technically call them moonshiners, but this was in the Record Herald I found. He sold 3 pints of moonshine to a couple of Waynesboro guys for $2 a pint. Now remember how much it would go for. So they thought they were getting a bargain. So they, they bought 3 pints. They went off to sample it. The guy went away with his $6. It was just muddy river water. So I don't even know. I guess technically, well, I guess he cheated them, but
They thought they
he,
were getting
they
something.
couldn't get him for moonshining.
Right.
Sir, I heard one time that the Catoctin Moonshiners had special people from New York every month to come and get a supply and take back to New York.
Well, apparently, since it's had a good reputation, I wouldn't doubt it. I know, I forget who it was. One of the Catoctin Moonshiners talked about, driving into DC with it hidden under his back seat. He'd do these Sunday drives into
heard that
DC with
too.
his kids and wife. Meanwhile, there's gallons of moonshine hidden under the back seat, and he was a doctor, but he also had contacts in Congress. So, Congresses, they, rules for thee, not for me, and so they had plenty of moonshine coming in for them, and he was one of their suppliers. Now, once you had the moonshine, or the passage of the 18th Amendment, then you get the phenomena of revenuers, those federal agents who coming in looking for the government money or looking to shut you down because you weren't. Well, it used to be that you weren't paying your government taxes on alcohol. Now it was you were just simply breaking the law. I actually have seen stories that say you can blame prohibition for our reliance now on the income tax. Because before prohibition, like taxes on alcohol and things like that, that was the major income generator for the United States government. And with prohibition, they lost their income, went way down, so they started relying on that newly passed income tax that Wilson had passed during the First World War. So the revenuers would go out, they'd be looking for the moonshiners, capturing them, but even being in jail, these moonshiners still were making moonshine in jail. There's one guy, very industrious, good entrepreneur, I guess you'd call him. His name was Walter Sprinkle from Waynesboro. And the one time he was in jail, in 1926, he was in jail for selling moonshine, and the sheriff, his name was Ankerbrand, started smelling something unusual, and he traced it down to a stone jug this guy had in his cell, and apparently he'd had friends when they came to visit him in jail. They'd also pass him a little bit of ripe fruits and things like that, and he'd take them, put them in that jug, let them ferment with some water, and he was making some rough moonshine of his own in the jail cell. And this was apparently not the first time he'd been caught making moonshine while in jail for selling moonshine. An earlier time, he'd actually been a trustee at the prison, and they caught him because he was in his position as trustee. He was getting things like raisins and other fruits that he could use to make moonshine from the commissary at the jail. So he had the jail paying for his own concoctions back then. Now, Penmar, of course, had a reputation, it was the big resort area during that same time, that Prohibition time. So very attractive marketplace for people wanting to come here, relax, and of course, they were hoping to drink at times. Blue Ridge Summit, in fact, had 3 distilleries, legal distilleries, before Prohibition. Now, after Prohibition, it became bootleggers. Now, since I mentioned distilleries, I want to show you something, what happened. Earlier this year, my wife and I were down at Savannah, and they had the National Prohibition Museum down there. And one thing I thought was interesting was when all these legal distilleries could no longer make their product, they had people needed to employ, trucks, equipment, so a lot of them retooled and reworked into legal enterprises. So they had this one display here of some of these legal enterprises that these well-known breweries and all were involved in. So you had things like Bud, frozen egg products, Coors, pure malted milk, Stroh's, pure malt syrup, and then some other, Dubois, Budweiser beverages, things like that were, you can pass that around and look at it. But, and that's from that, so I'm guessing that's what happened to the distilleries here. But then you have the bootleggers come in, they take over, lots of wooded areas so they can hide the stills, and they were hiding a lot of stills up here.
Who had the stills? Who had the stills and did this?
The stills? I don't know, I don't have any names particularly for any moonshiners up here, but they also did not make themselves very, they did not get their names out there a lot. So, unless you have somebody who's willing to admit it, it's hard to find a lot of moonshiner names, or unless they were arrested, like that Walter Sprinkle guy. So, for instance, 1921, an informant told police that there were 13 stills he knew of personally in the vicinity of Penmar. There was let's see, where's the other one that had? The Hagerstown Mail reported, I'm trying to find the year for that, 1923, estimated that between Hagerstown and the Pennsylvania line in Washington County, there were at least 500 stills.
How many?
500. A lot of drunks in northern Washington County.
Or entrepreneurs.
And the Gettysburg Compiler had an informant that told them once, if it starts to go dim, just tap it, it'll brighten up again. But the Gettysburg Compiler had an informant tell them how he witnessed one of these moonshiners operate. So, you have all the hotels and all that you had up on Penmar, people out and about walking, getting nature in. And this guy, looking like a salesman, would come in, up onto the trail. He'd set up kind of like a folding table, open up his little suitcase, and he'd start selling pints of moonshine. And when he was out, he'd close it up, disappear into the woods, and about half an hour, 45 minutes later, he'd pop up somewhere else on another trail. Fresh batch, already, bottled and ready to sell.
Can you pull it up again? No, I lost it.
That's
It's American
Wow.
entrepreneurship.
got into
Admire that one.
Location of the stills.
That's still some ginormous. How much sugar would that take? I think that's Blue Blazes we were talking about. I think if you ran that much sugar, it had to be a little suspicious of what you're up to.
See, I always had a sweet tooth.
So yeah, they were doing a thriving business up here. They had the people, they had the material, and filling that demand. Now, the revenuers, of course, they would hear about things going on up here. In 1925, a guy in Cascade named Daniel Toms had a 30-gallon still that he was running. Revenuers caught on to him, tried to arrest him. He held them off for a while with a shotgun, but it was just him and another guy, and so eventually they got enough revenuers and police in the area to surround him, and he finally gave up. In Cascade as well in 1926, following year. A guy named Joseph Ecker. His home was actually burned to the ground. He believed it was because he was an informant to the revenuers about who was moonshining in the area. Now, 1920 Record Herald had an article that said, quote, talking about moonshining, quote, "The amount is considerable, and that just now there is such a wave of drunkenness in the city as has not been known for some time." So it was not working if they were wanting to stop people from drinking. Smithsburg, in particular, they actually had a moonshining war that went on for a while between the families and operations of John Klein and Henry Russman. There were reports you could find in the papers in the early 20s of night raiding, shooting, fights. They were accused of burning down a church, dynamiting a sawmill, killing at least one person, wounding a lot of others. So, and it was big business. I mean, you know, so it was worth it for people to put their lives on the line like that because the payoff was just so disproportionate. Did everybody get to see the? Now I'll show you another one real quick. This one, they called it the Whiskey Waterfall. I forget where it was, but in this particular town, they had a moonshining operation going on the second floor of a building. The revenuers raided it, and they were lazy. They didn't want to roll those barrels down to the first floor and out where they would break them open and dump them. So they just broke them open on the second floor and dumped the alcohol out the second floor window. There was another picture. I didn't get a copy of it, but when they would take the moonshine out and break the caskets open on the street and let it run down the sides of the streets, kids would run out with cups and bottles to scoop it up to take back to their parents, you know, to get what they could in the cups and bottles.
Alcoholics, that's where it started.
So yeah, it's in demand. Now the big story around here is, before I get to that one, Franklin County in particular had a reputation of being a place you did not want to get caught with liquor, illegal liquor, if you were an out-of-towner, because they had turned it into, the police had turned it into a way to make even more money than if they were running speed traps. So they catch you with liquor, the fines were crazy. There was one guy, S.A. Broadus from Lexington, Kentucky, got caught with a quart. So he's not a moonshiner, he's just personal consumption. But he got caught with a quart of moonshine in Franklin County, fined $100, and lost his car. So,
Get the moonshine?
good point. I hope so after all that. I mean, but the Hagerstown Daily Mail wrote, "The word has long since gone around this section of the country to keep out of Franklin County if you have any liquor about your person." So yeah, they found another way to monetize it for themselves in the county. So, but the big story around here would be the story of the Blue Blazes still on Catoctin Mountain. The operation could hold 25,000 gallons of mash. So, I mean, that's still out there, 50 gallons. So, you know, many, many times that size. I don't want to try and figure out the math right now. And the value of that would mean that probably at any given time you had, like well over $600,000 in alcohol at that site. So a big business, a big operation, and the Frederick News described it as, interesting, one of the largest in the county, which I've never seen any other larger one noted in Frederick County. They, so I'm curious where the other larger operations were, if there were, and how big they were. But July 31st, 1929, word had come down to the Frederick County Sheriff's Office through an informer of a moonshining operation on the county. So at that time, 77 was pretty much just a dirt road up this mountain. So they rode up that road very slowly, trying not to raise any dust. They parked, and two people got out. Deputy John Hemp and Lester Hoffman. He was the informant. And Hoffman was carrying one of those moonshine type jugs. So, and Hemp was in his own clothes. So they walk up a trail, and they come to a rock where this guy holding a rifle is sitting. And so they just tap that. Hopefully that's all it takes. Yeah. So they came up to this guy sitting on a rock with his rifle, and the Frederick Post said the exchange went like this. Where are you going? And this is interesting because the Post writes it like it sounds. So instead of you, it's Y-U-H. Going without the last G. So where are you going, the man asked. We want to buy some liquor, Hemp said. You better get, G-I-T, out of here if you don't want to get shot. So you can't, you're not supposed to do that nowadays in newspaper articles. But anyway, so they didn't press the fact because having the guy sit there with the rifle pretty much confirmed what they wanted to know. The operation was where Hoffman was saying it was. So they went back to the cars, the two cars. They were joined by some other deputies, Vernon Redmond, William Wertenbaker, William Steiner, and Clyde Hauver. And then that group of six, they start out towards the still. When they got to the rock, that lookout was missing, so obviously he must have realized something was going on too, had gone back to kind of alert the crew at the operation. The deputies continue on, they come into the clearing, and a gunfight ensues. They start to, and there's only actually just a few of the moonshiners there were armed. Most of them weren't. Everybody, there were more armed deputies than there were moonshiners. Mm-hmm. But they started exchanging gunfire, the moonshiners started running off, and the deputies chase after them. They see Clyde Hauver fall, but they think he just trips on a root from a tree. And so they continue their pursuit of the deputy or the moonshiners. They don't catch them. They know the little roots, the game trails, things like that, little hideaways. So they're able to get away. So the deputies come back, and then they see Clyde Hauver still on the ground and bleeding. You know, he's been shot. So they call for a doctor. They get Dr. Byerly from Thurmont to come up. He's calling for an ambulance, but the ambulance has to come all the way from Frederick, and it's not as easy or as fast coming from Frederick back then as it is nowadays. But they get that call in. The ambulance arrives. They start to head back. Clyde Hauver's in really bad condition. It's so bad that one of the Maryland State Troopers with him, John Taylor, actually gives him a blood transfusion on the ride to the hospital from his own. I don't know whether they typed him or not, or they just figured he just needed blood to keep alive. Wow. But it was that desperate that bouncing on these, roads, poor quality roads back then, they were willing to try and do that to save Deputy Halver's life. But by the time they got to the hospital, he had no heartbeat, and they said he pretty much had still bled out anyway. Meanwhile, the law enforcement that was still back at the site, they started destroying the mash stills and the vats. One thing I'll point out, that I'm pretty sure is one of the boilers. They had boilers from steam locomotives they were using, turned upright. So I'm thinking that is probably one of them. This is probably another one. But that just tells you how the, yeah, there's another shot of all the mash vats there.
Wow.
So each one can hold, I think what they say, 500 gallons. So gives you this idea of the scope of the effort they were doing. So after the death of Deputy Halver, intensive manhunt goes out for these moonshiners. They do eventually catch them, but then there's other odd things that start getting mentioned about the whole incident. The biggest one is that Deputy Halver was shot in the back of the head. So, since he was running to the moonshiners, one of the defenses at their trial came, he was shot from behind, not in front. So the rumor was that one of those other deputies in the group was having an affair with his wife. Now that was never proven, and I spoke one time with Halver's grandson, said if it was true, his grandmother must have broken it off right at the time that the grandfather, that Clyde Halver was killed, because she never remarried, and he does not remember her ever having, dates or a boyfriend or anything like that. So, another problem with the case was they said that the caliber of the bullet that killed him did not match the caliber of any of the weapons that the moonshiners had. Another problem. There was another story that circulated that Halver had not been the intended target, that someone had wanted to kill Deputy Redmond, pretty much for the same reason, that they were having an affair with his wife, but wound up shooting Halver accidentally. So a lot of unanswered questions that kind of came out of that. But they did, 8 men were arrested, 2 were charged, Charles Lewis and Lester Clark. They were charged with murder because it turned out they were the only 2 moonshiners with weapons. But, as I said, neither of their weapons was the caliber of the weapon that killed Clyde Halver. But Washington County Circuit Court convicted Lewis of first-degree murder in 1930. Clark was, and he was sentenced to life. Clark was sentenced to 15 years at the state penitentiary. And they proclaimed innocence until they died. Now, eventually, Lewis's life sentence was commuted in 1951 because he was poor health. He was 65. He was pardoned, but he only lived like 2 more years before he died. So, and now Clyde Halver's name is on the National Officers Down Memorial. He's the only county deputy killed in the line of duty. So since those revenuers and deputies destroyed the still, there's another shot of it. So this, the caption says 13 fermenting vats, 2 condensing coils, a cooling box, and a steam locomotive boiler, which, yeah, there it is, same boiler back there. So this, if you go to Catoctin Mountain Park, this is what they show you for the blue blazes still. Do they look similar?
You have a good imagination.
And this still is even smaller than that one out there.
Is it even?
Oh no, it's the same. It's the same size. I thought it was 35, but this, my notes say it's 50-gallon pot still. Was taken from a Tennessee raid. But that's what they use now when they go give the talks for the Blue Blazes still and what happened there. Now, moonshining continues, and even the Park Service was guilty of it. Because this still, they operated legally from 1970 to 1989, making moonshine that was for demonstration purposes.
Yeah.
And they would always, supposedly it was made in a way that would not have been drinkable, they said. But the funny thing is, they had, I mean, they're federal government, so they had the proper permission from the Treasury Department to operate a still on federal property. The first day they started operation in 1970, the Maryland Alcohol Division raided them and shut them down until they went through the proper channels to get Maryland's permission to operate a still. So there was an article I found that quoted former Park Superintendent Frank Menser, and he said, "I'm still known as the only park superintendent in the service who's been rated for being a moonshiner." And that's the still they were operating. So, that's just a nice general shot of what got taken in one raid. Also, as you all probably know, Prohibition led to the rise of organized crime, gave them a lot of money and power. The Untouchables type TV series and movies. You know, any of you ever see Some Like It Hot with Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon? You know, that had a lot of moonshining themes in it too. Great movie, by the way, you should watch it. It's hilarious. Now, pharmacists, they had kind of a loophole that they could get around. They were actually allowed to use alcohol, to buy it, to sell it as part of medicinal medicines that they made up. But they were supposed to have them locked up in bank-like vaults after hours to protect them. I found a story, Shoemaker's Drugstore in Chambersburg was once robbed, not for the money, but they broke into the vault to get their alcohol supplies. So, now, one thing I also learned at that Prohibition Museum was Walgreens. Walgreens Pharmacy, at the beginning of Prohibition, had about 500 stores. At the end of Prohibition, had about 5,000. They were known as the friendly pharmacy. The pharmacists were willing to give you prescriptions for just about anything. And guess what those prescriptions contained? So they're believed to pretty much have made their, breakthrough success on the extra money they could charge for alcohol medicines. And it was amazing, wherever there was a Walgreens pharmacy, there were a lot of sick people in those neighborhoods. So, Prohibition caused more problems than it helped. Up here, it was big business. I guess it kept I was told once that it pretty much kept a lot of the farmers, from going under after or going into the Depression. They had built up some money from making a lot of extra moonshine and selling, and they could do it legally. I mean, in many cases, they would just sell their product to moonshiners, so that was perfectly legal, and they could get top dollar for selling, say, their corn to a moonshiner as opposed to selling it at a farm stand. So that's what they were doing, perfectly legal, made them a lot of money. And then the moonshiners made even more money. But, you know, it helped the farmers around here. So finally, because it was so unpopular, Prohibition was repealed shortly after Franklin Roosevelt was elected. That was one of the planks he ran on in 32. And of course, it was a very popular thing. I'm sure got him a lot of votes from both sides. And it's interesting, you can see lots of newspaper stories of when Prohibition ended, everybody out drinking in the streets and raising a glass in bars and things like that. So, you know, now someplace like Baltimore was known as pretty much ignoring Prohibition when it was in. And you know, the police were helping the moonshiners hide everything. So the revenuers just were frustrated to no end, someplace like that. So, but so that is the story of moonshining in this area. Any questions?
Where did you find the information on the distilleries that were in Blue Ridge?
It came up when I was going through an article. One of the Record Herald articles just mentioned it. It didn't name the distilleries. It just said that there had been 3 distilleries before Prohibition here in Blue Ridge Summit. And my guess, like I said, was probably they opened here for the same reason the bootleggers opened here. They had that large marketplace of people who wanted their product. And so they came in and set up. Now, I also don't know how large an operation they were running either. But yeah, it makes you think, where were they?
Well, I know where the 4th one's gonna go.
Anybody else?
Well,
Yes, ma'am.
you said they mixed the grain, the sugar, and the yeast
Yeah,
and let it ferment.
right.
Then they skimmed off the top.
Yeah, because as it ferments,
Yeah.
the heavier stuff drops.
Right.
So they take the liquid out of those wooden vats and put it into the boiler.
Right. So what do they do with the sediment? That becomes something that has a
Oh.
market value?
Okay, they would actually do that again with the set. They'd put more water and add some more water and sugar.
Freshen it up a bit.
Yeah, and they'd go through the process. It was said that you could do that about 3 times
The mash.
with the mash before, you know. Now, I'm sure some of those
Got completely gross.
corner cutting moonshiners probably ran it, did it a 4th time or more. But 3 times was what Kenny said you could run a normal amount of, as long as you freshened it up, as you said, and that you could still get a good potent product from.
Then they could throw that grain, mushy grain pig farm or something?
Yeah,
God, who
you know
knows?
what, if the pigs would eat it, yeah, I mean, I guess it might taste all right, little sweet grain mush, yeah, they'd probably like it. You know, you could use it maybe for some sort of fertilizer or something, but,
Happy roses.
yeah. But yeah, so you could get 3 batches from that.
Do you think there's any working stills around?
Oh, I'm sure, you asked that question earlier, didn't you? I'm sure somebody, yeah, I mean, you got people doing like home brews in the, experimenting with just home brews. So I'm sure somebody's running some small still operation, maybe not a big still operation, but yes, there's somebody who's gonna be running and making their own stuff. Why not? Just for experimenting. I mean, plenty of recipes out there, plenty of ways to put a still together. Plans are out there. The fun thing was when the Park Service got the still from Tennessee, no one knew how, or no one would admit that they knew how to put it together. No, I mean, that was the thing. They went to all these people that they thought were moonshiners, and suddenly they're like, moonshine, what's that? You know? So no one, because they all thought somebody was trying to trap them. Nobody admitted how to put it together. So they finally found plans for how to put a still together in a high school newspaper in Tennessee.
Wow.
So I mean, you know, and it's only gotten easier to get the information since then. So yeah, I'm sure people have operation. I'm sure you go home and hook it up, don't you? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's out there. I mean, there's legal moonshining too. You know, you pay your government taxes.
Right, you gotta pay the.
Yeah.
How long did
revenue
Blue
man
Blazes operate?
How long?
How long? Like, was it up there like for years or?
It was up there for years, but I don't know how many. I mean, 29 was when it shut down, so it could have been it. I mean, and it also depends on, I'm sure it did not start off that big. But, you know, at the max would have been 9 years. If it started when everything went into effect, beginning of 1920 to when they destroyed it in 29, but it might have just been like a small 50-gallon still to start.
Because getting sugar up there for that many, I mean, I know people knew, right?
You know somebody. People know people. Yeah.
And a lot of people were afraid to report or say anything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because
For various reasons. Well, like the one guy I said, they burned his house down. But others, it's just because, kind of like a Godfather syndrome. There was somebody in Lewistown, when I was at the talk, when you had the library years ago, they were talking about somebody in Lewistown was well known for being very generous with money. He was a moonshiner. He also expected you not to rat him out on anything too. But so you can have the people who had the carrot and the people who had the stick.
So I haven't read much about any moonshining in this area, but I did read an article, I'll have to find it, about kids that were exploring caves. So I was reading about the caves in the area, and when they were exploring a cave during Prohibition, they came across this still operation,
Not
and that was a
surprising.
big bust,
There
you
are
know,
stories you'll find in the newspapers around here. There was one, in particular, I remember reading two kids out. They wasn't a cave, but they were just out in the woods.
Right.
And came across a still operation, and they went and got their dad to show him, and by the time they got back, they'd already moved it.
Oh, wow.
Somebody is watching.
So you break it down real quick, and
Keep going
all you
for
have
good.
left is like charred embers from the fires they used. So yeah, they were very, they watched out for anybody who caught sight of them, and but yeah, caves would have been a good hiding place. They would have dissipated any steam or smoke coming out from the boilers or the fires. The coolness of the cave would have kept it from getting too hot around the boilers too. So, excellent location.
Well,
for it.
somebody told me this year they were hunting mushrooms back in Foxville.
Yep.
And they used to go there hunting mushrooms all the time, and they came across the place in Foxville, way back in the mountains somewhere, that there was a lot of evil stuff put up. And there was like a cross there, and they had like an imitation of a dead person hanging on it. And said,
And they were
if
trying to
you
keep
do
it
not want this to happen, do not go any farther.
Sounds like they're making another sequel to Blair
And
Witch
this guy
Project.
said he'd never go back there again. He said it made the chills go over him.
Well, you gotta, like I said, it's
That's amazing.
big business. Now it's not. See, the thing is, one of the reasons I don't think you'd see a big moonshining operation nowadays is because it's legal.
Yeah.
So people who want to drink, they're not going to pay an exorbitant amount of money for it
They don't have to
when they
hide
can
the
go
woods
to a
or-
local brewery and get something. So you cut out a lot of that profit incentive, but somebody still might be doing it for personal use.
I don't know if it had personal reasons or not.
Remember, wasn't down in that area Ralph working years and years and years ago? Remember, didn't he have one?
Yes.
Well, I have heard stories of people finding remnants of old still operations on the mountains. Just wandering off, and they'll come across bits and pieces of some old operation. Anything else? Okay, well, thanks for having me out this evening.